Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more.
So today we are here with Lauren Ornelas. How are you? Thank you for being here.
I'm okay, thanks. How are you doing?
I am good. We enjoyed a little bit of chit chat before we got started about Chicago, Cali, all the things. So why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about your journey to founding your organization?
Sure. It's a long journey, but I'll make it as brief as possible. I think it really starts from when I was young. My parents got divorced when I was really little, and I grew up in Texas. I'm no longer there. But when, growing up, I would see a lot of cows in the fields, and I would think like, I don't want to be responsible for separating that mom from the baby or the baby from the mom, because I knew my mom, had to raise my sisters and I by herself and had to get a job. And so I knew it was like to be separated from her. And I didn't want to be responsible for that. There was no like this is a retrospect thing, it's not like I thought that at the time, like, oh, this is why I feel that way. But it was more like my heart would just hurt just thinking about being responsible for separating them. So I went vegetarian when I was really young, and my family didn't have a lot of money. So eventually I had to go back to eating animals. And I also, I'm Mexican. I'm a very proud Mexican. Hispanics. So acknowledge my indigenous roots as well as like a slam to patriarchy at the end, because Spanish language is so patriarchal, and also allyship with the trans community. I was raised with an understanding of the grape boycott that was going on at the time, that farm workers were asking people to not eat grapes because of the way they were treated. So I kind of had an understanding of that since I was young. And by the time I was in high school, in 1987, I got involved with a citywide animal rights organization. I went vegan in 1988. And during this time, apartheid was still going on in South Africa. And one of the ways that you could voice your opposition to it, so to speak, was to not support companies that were vested in the regime. So I started boycotting companies that were still operating in South Africa. And so, I basically did everything, went to college and everything for activism. And I started a number of animal rights organizations, and I worked for a number of animal rights organizations where I conducted and did investigations at factory farms and slaughterhouses. But in 2000, when I learned about what was happening in Western Africa for chocolate, which includes slavery and child labor, I became a bit more outspoken about it. At the time, there was also a potential boycott against strawberries for farm workers. And so in 2006, I spoke at the World Social Forum in Caracas, Venezuela, and I was surrounded by people who looked like me, who thought like I did, who were interested in stopping water privatization and environment and workers and immigration and everything I was. And I just realized that I wanted to found an organization that looked at these issues simultaneously as equals, that didn't say this is more important than the other, that you didn't have to choose. You could say, I believe in liberation, or collective liberation, as we would say now, but liberation for human and non-human animals, and want to look at all these ways in which with our food choices, we can make an impact. So in 2007, I founded the Food Empowerment Project.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing up the intersectionality of all of these issues. I think often veganism gets reduced to just one aspect of it. And, vegans have a bad rep on the internet.
Yeah. Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about what Food Empowerment Project does?
Sure. I always like to say too, is that this is what a vegan organization looks like when it's founded by a woman of color.
Love
That
that.
we look at all of this together, it's very hard for us to, pull these things apart. So speaking of which, one of the main areas we work on is farm worker justice. Because, those of us who want people to go vegan to decrease the suffering of non-human animals, we want more people to eat produce. But in and of itself, there's an injustice taking place against those who consume produce. So, which is everybody, unless you grow all of your own food. So for me, if I didn't want to consume animal products because the way the animals are treated and they are killed at the end of it, there's no way I could not care about the way farm workers are treated. The difference being, of course, is that we all need produce to sustain ourselves. We all need fruits and vegetables. And so, we go in the direction of advocating for and uplifting the voices of farm workers. And we do this through legislative, corporate. We support farm worker called boycotts, such as that called by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida against Wendy's and also Publix grocery store. We also do a school supply drive for the children of farm workers every year. And we do this not as a way, we don't see it as an act of charity. We see it as a way to help right an injustice that's taking place against farm workers, where their families are sacrificing so much for their children to have a good education, that this is one way we can give back. Go ahead.
No, can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
You've been talking about the treatment of farm workers, and I don't know that folks may necessarily know what that looks like in real time. So when you talk about this mistreatment, what do you mean?
I mean so California is where a majority of the agriculture in our country comes from. And in fact, is where a lot of, foods, even like pistachios, go to around the world, come from California. So farm workers in California are the bulk of who are feeding people produce in this country. And you have people who are unhoused. They are living in pickup trucks, cardboard boxes along the rivers. And some of these people work for incredibly wealthy companies like wineries, and yet they do not have a roof over their heads. They live in substandard housing. So that's just where they live. Their working conditions, some farm workers face rampant sexual harassment. They face wage theft, which means they may have somebody, an intermediary, who they are getting the job from, and that contractor can just take their money and they never get paid. A lot of farm workers don't have basic protections that most workers have: health insurance, vacation days, sick days, and they aren't all paid, a living income. They don't necessarily, some farm workers are paid by the hour, but not all farm workers are. Some are paid by how much they pick, which then means that maybe older farm workers aren't going to get as much, so it's really dependent on how fast they can pick. They also are exposed to agricultural chemicals. So there's a lot that farm workers, and again, just crouching all day long, to pick produce and things like that. And, they're proud of the jobs that they do, and they should be. They're feeding all of us, but we owe them more, especially with the climate crisis. You have farm workers who are working in extreme heats, then you have extreme floods. There's no protection to them from these wide range of temperatures that they're dealing with. So, this is how it is. As much as I would like to think that things changed back in the day when I first learned about farm worker justice issues in the 1970s, but a lot hasn't changed.
So I have two follow-up questions. One is kind of trying to paint a clearer picture of this issue, is like, what are the demographics of the farm workers? So like, who are they? What do they look like? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. The vast majority Latinx farm workers. We have documented and undocumented farm workers. You also have one of the things that I like to talk about when talking about this issue, so I really appreciate you asking this question, is that a lot of the farm workers are also indigenous from Mexico, specifically Oaxaca. And they don't speak English or Spanish. They speak their indigenous languages. So when we had two major issues, our organization used to be based in Sonoma County, and two major issues that faced us at one point. One was COVID. A lot of the information coming out about COVID was not in indigenous languages for the workers who, again, are picking our food. So they face great barriers to accessing any type of assistance because of that, the fact that they didn't speak either of the languages. We also had fires destroying the communities, and there again weren't resources for them to even understand like emergency calls that were going out for the fires. So, again, regardless of anything, these are the people who are picking our food, and all human beings should be treated with decency and dignity. It doesn't matter. I mean, as we know, borders is a social construct. What is a border? So, this is the Americas, like it's not just the United States that's America. This is the Americas. And so, we owe it to everybody, who is working in California to be treated with dignity and respect and have the information they need and suitable languages to protect themselves and their families.
So my follow-up, I think you said something really important, which is, this is similar to when you first learned about this topic in the 70s. And so the second question I had is, why do you think not much has changed?
Agriculture is incredibly powerful. They are very, very powerful. And that goes for impact on human and non-human animals. But they can prevent a lot of laws from going into effect to protect farm workers. There isn't enough money on the enforcement side as well. And I think that's a big part of why. I think that there's something to be said as well that, if I look at the work of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and I just looked at their work, I would say they are incredibly successful because of two things. One is they're harnessing corporate power and using consumers to push corporations to stand for something by saying we do care about who picks our food and how they're treated. They've been incredibly successful in that, and that I do think is a very powerful direction to go into when looking at farm worker justice issues. The other one is the Fair Food program that they have is based on the workers themselves. It's not some third-party certification coming in. It is the workers themselves who know what it's like to work in these conditions, advocating for themselves and each other. And that is where the strength, my organization, Food Empowerment Project, we're now a collective, because we believe in this model. We believe that the people doing the job should be the ones advocating for themselves. And we lend support as much as possible when it comes to farm workers. But I think that's why their Fair Food program has been so successful, is because it's the farm workers themselves who are demanding the changes and who are teaching each other.
I had to mute because my dog kept barking. So I don't think I typically don't record at home. We usually record in the studio. And so I normally don't have those distractions. So listeners don't know that I have a Chihuahua mix who likes to protect the house all the time from everything.
That's sweet.
So I kind of want to pivot a little bit. I think this topic is really interesting, but the other reason I really wanted to talk to you was because I wanted to talk about the environmental impact of how we eat in general, but also consuming animal products. Because I think one of the things that people don't realize is that piece of it. Like, this is not just again, vegans get a bad rep. This is not just like a personal choice, but I'm like, this choice actually has widespread impact. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And thank you for saying that, because it's true. I mean, we want to make everything about individuality in this country. And in reality is we need to be looking for each other. If we were looking out for each other, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in right now in so many regards. So when we look at, I'll take dairy as an example. Columbus brought the cows over on his second voyage. And so we like to talk about colonization and how dairy is a product of colonization. It is a legacy of colonization. And that's why so many indigenous and Black and brown people cannot consume dairy. It's not something my ancestors consumed. It's not something that is inherent to us. And instead we call it lactose normal, because, and when you use the term lactose intolerant, one, it implies there's something wrong with those of us who can't digest lactose. And two, there's nothing really natural about consuming the milk of another species, much less into adulthood. So, we feel like it's important to highlight colonization in the dairy industry. But we take a look at the environmental impacts, and you have that one dairy cow produces 120 pounds of wet manure per day. Now, we have dairy farms in California that have as many as 17,000 cows. There's no sewer treatment facility to take care of that water. So what happens is that all of this gets into our air, it gets into our water. We have, environmental racism, where Black, brown, and Indigenous people are the most impacted by animal farms. And here in California, where we are the #1 dairy producing state, in one of the highest producing counties, 1 in 6 kids has asthma. The miscarriage rates in another county doubles because of contaminated water. And you add to that they spray that manure onto surrounding fields that impact people living in the area. So you have, real problems taking place and impacting communities because of the dairy industry. Now, we can look even further into something where you don't need statistics, and you say to yourself, okay, plants need to be watered. They need to be harvested. That takes energy. Then we turn around and feed that food to the cows, who also need water. Then you take the fact that the cows have to be transported, which takes energy, and then the slaughter process, which is horrifically cruel to the animals, certainly isn't great for the workers either. And you have more water usage and more energy usage and more waste. So it's like very simple. I know that sometimes people want to make it seem really complicated, but these things are really simple if you just think about the creation of waste and the usage of water and energy.
I think you just brought up some really scary statistics, like doubling the miscarriage rate and increase in asthma. Like, that was information I was not familiar with. And I thought I knew quite a bit about this topic. But what is some of the other, I think digging into that more, what is some of the other impact that we're seeing from these practices?
Well, I mean, environment on total, I mean, if you look at North Carolina, which is one of the largest pig killing states in the country, and again, you have Black and Indigenous people primarily impacted by it, where these people, they can't open their windows in the summertime because flies are so bad. Their property values are practically useless because no one wants to live near these facilities. So we are impacting, obviously, the lives of non-human animals. We're impacting the environment, and we're greatly impacting communities. So I think that, looking beyond that, I mean, we have the impact. I mean, I don't know if I feel like most people can look up what happens to the animals, but, you do have cows who are very social creatures and who are really good mamas who have their babies taken away from them. And there's, you can look online, there's plenty of stories talking about moms and baby cows crying to each other when they're separated. I video recorded a mom and a baby in a small dairy in Georgia, where the mom and the baby are bellowing back and forth to each other because they want to be together. There's stories about how they fight to be with each other. The mom wants to be with her baby after she's held her baby in her for 9 months. And then you have the worker aspect of it. You have workers who are also suffering from respiratory problems, who are, working in manure. We interviewed a dairy worker a couple months ago. We're going to be releasing the interview with him soon, but he talked just about what it was like just to work in manure constantly, and he also talked about how it makes him feel on his own to separate the moms. His job is actually separating the moms and the babies, and how hard it was for him and how heartbreaking. And because of all the manure, he also added he doesn't drink milk anymore. And so the ramifications are wide. I mean, we could talk about health and things like that too, but specifically the environment, obviously the cows and the goats, and workers are negatively impacted by the dairy industry.
Let's talk about the animal component of it for a little bit. It's funny. So I went to an all girls Catholic school, and I love talking about this because I had a really interesting experience. And this school focused a lot on social justice. So we had to cover different issues of social justice. And I think the way that my school broke down social justice was climate justice, animal rights, human rights. Like they covered the entire spectrum and really talked about intersectionality throughout. But I think that the way that we talk about social justice today is very centered around human rights specifically. And then how human rights specifically tie with climate justice, or human rights specifically tie with food justice, right? And so, like, I'm a little hesitant to go into this area because I know we start to get a little bit more controversial, and that's animal rights, right? And so I think what's really hard for folks to digest when we start talking about animal rights is that there's also a ton of science out there that says that animals don't have feelings the way that we have feelings. That if you have a religious upbringing, that I've heard the argument that God gave dominion over the animals. I've heard the argument that indigenous folks ate buffalo, for example. So like we have evolved to eat meat. That's part of our diet. And so there's all these arguments that, again, go towards this idea that eating meat is a very perfectly acceptable thing to do. And also it's an individual choice. And so I just, whichever part of that you want to respond
Yeah,
to.
no, I mean, I think that for me, it's simply about reducing suffering. There is a tremendous amount of suffering in this world. And if I can reduce any amount of it, that's what I want to do. And it's a very simple lens for me, because I can't control all of the suffering. And if I can control some of it, I'm going to do my best not to be a part of that. I think as well, though, is looking at where does it come from to where we believe that we have the right to treat another living being that way? Because that same way of thinking is why we treat human beings that same way too. Because we have justifications and rationalizations why it's okay to treat another living being that way. And so for me, I think that's the thread of it, is that we need to look at it as, where does this sense of domination come from? And do I want to perpetuate that way of thinking that impacts any feeling sentient being? And for people to think that animals don't feel pain, that means they've never, ever, ever had a companion animal to where they maybe stepped on their tail, because it would be weird to imply
Makes your
that,
heart.
yes. And why would anybody think a cow or a pig are different? I mean, there's no, except for us telling ourselves that it's okay to treat one differently than another. And that's what we tell ourselves. And that's what we've told ourselves in wars against other people and other nations, that somehow there's a difference. And that's why it's okay to treat them a certain way. So I think that we need to look at not othering other beings, and look at a way in which we can exist in this world with causing the least harm. And I want to say that I acknowledge, and this is something that we work on at Food Empowerment Project as well, I'm not going to say, oh, it's easy for everybody to go vegan, because I know it's not. But for those of us who have the privilege and the ability to go vegan, then that is one way of reducing some suffering in the world.
There was this interview, and I am a very big pop culture fan, that really always stood out to me. And it was Cameron Diaz. And young folks may not even know who Cameron Diaz is at this point. But it was Cameron Diaz, and she was being interviewed about her food choices. And she was like, yeah, I learned, and I don't remember exactly the numbers, but I think she said something to the fact that I learned that like pigs are just as smart as like a 3-year-old. And she was like, my niece is 3, so this pig is just as smart as my toddler. She's like, that's like eating my niece. And she was like, that's kind of how she came around to the idea of like, maybe this isn't the right choice.
I totally remember that. Yeah. I mean, and that's what it is, I mean, and you learn things about animals like fish who protect each other, who'll watch each other's back while the other one's eating, fish who do all sorts of things that, like, because they look different, somehow we can justify that they don't feel the same as we do. And maybe we just haven't
that
gotten
logic.
well.
I've heard that logic too before, because they look different. They don't feel, we can justify that thing that you just said. I'm like, we've definitely used that for other populations before, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And so why not just break down that entire way of thinking? And what's so wrong about being compassionate? What's so wrong was saying. I mean, I know that it's hard, that's a cultural thing, Food Empowerment Project, we have different vegan guides to represent our team, but also other cultures, Filipino food, Chinese food, Lao food, vegan soul food. We're doing vegan Indian food next. There's a way for so many of us to celebrate our cultures without animal suffering in them, because a lot of the time the animal products are, a lot of it's using spices, that make it taste a certain way.
I will say, I think vegan Indian food is really easy. I spent a couple of weeks in India and did not touch meat the entire time I was there.
Nice.
So
Well,
that's a perk. There was something, hold on, what was it? Feelings. Okay. Oh, so I'm just throwing all the arguments I've ever heard in life at you
yeah,
right now, because I'm like,
go
let's
ahead.
talk about.
Been vegan for over 35 years. Let's see.
But another one that I've also heard is, especially when we're talking about marginalized communities, there is a lot of, I don't even know what to call it, but there's a sense of white folks already care about animals more than they care about people. There's jokes about white women rescuing dogs, but being willing to call the cops on Black men. And so, like, this idea of like, how can I care about this other issue when people are dying, I think is another thing that frequently comes up.
Well, one of the things when we talk about our work is that people need to do what they do. People can go vegan, not support circuses and Sea Worlds out there, and not have to change anything that they do. They're still able to do and advocate for whatever and whoever they want. Me going out to protests frequently this year, and doesn't, that me being vegan and me doing the work that I do doesn't prevent me from doing that. Just like if somebody's organizing those protests does not prevent them from being able to be vegan. I think that when we start to create this one or the other is the problem. These issues are all related. They're all related. They're all part of the same thread of exploitation, oppression, and I would say capitalism. They're all part of that same thread that others are expendable. And so, I don't think that we need to say, I mean, I can't, I can't deny that there are some vegans who do not share and do not support Food Empowerment Project, because we do see all of these issues as very important, very equal. But that, I would say that one of the most beautiful things about where Food Empowerment Project is now is the young people get us. In the beginning of our organization's existence, it was being at events and trying to justify why we had every right to be there. And now the young people are like they get it. We don't need to explain any of that to them. And so I'm hopeful in the direction of the vegan movement in terms of understanding that we should be, believing in ending oppression and exploitation for all as equal. If that helps answer your question. I can't speak to those other people, certainly, because they do not share my values.
Yeah, no, I think this is a common issue in general where we tend to think of problems as either or. Like, I can't care about multiple issues at the same time. I can't advocate for multiple issues at the same time. And I also don't think that like what you care about is fixed. Like, you can work more towards this one issue today and pivot based on what is priority to you later. And so that's, I think, another piece of it. But I've noticed this just ongoing conversation that's very like trying to just
It's
boil it down to easy points.
Again, it's that mine's more important than yours. Mine is better than yours. Mine is the biggest social justice crisis in the world right now. And you're just like, really? They're all pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
Let's work together to stop all of them. And I like to bring up like the 1960s. What if people would have felt that way then?
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, there were multiple issues people were working on. And I like to always bring up Martin Luther King Jr. because Martin Luther King Jr., as we all know, worked on the civil rights movement. But when he became seriously dangerous was when he started talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and he started talking about the janitors. When he started about talking about like all of this as one thing. And so I think that what we do is we also prevent us and our movements who are against oppression and exploitation of living beings, whether it be human or non-human animals, we ignore the strength that we have if we work together.
So, what would be I mean, obviously, veganism is one answer, but for other folks who are not like ready to take as drastic of a step, what would be some like things that people can do to reduce their carbon footprint from this aspect and or assist with like workers' rights and food justice?
Well, I know it may feel drastic to go vegan. I'm just going to throw it out there that maybe you eat vegan sometimes and you don't even realize it. Maybe you had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch and you ate vegan for that meal. But I would say that, one of the things, at least for like, farm workers, is that even though organic doesn't mean that the workers are treated better necessarily, it does mean that they're not being doused with agricultural chemicals. And that's important. I'm trying to think of, in general, like things that people can do. I hate to sound so trite, but a lot of the stuff that's out there is true. I mean, reduce, reuse, like all that kind of stuff. We strongly encourage people to go to things like farmers markets when they can. And we encourage people to go to Black, Brown, and Indigenous farm booths because they've experienced more barriers to being there than maybe other farmers have. And so really just doing that, buying local thing. I mean, again, food is a big part of what's contributing to the climate crisis. There's just no getting around that part of it being a huge part.
I got a random question for you, and I haven't talked about this with anybody ever. So, Whole Foods rating of meat.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar? I'm assuming you're familiar with it.
Very.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I actually ran a campaign against Whole Foods Market for years and was the spark that got the co-founder of Whole Foods Market to go vegan. And so my campaign against Whole Foods is what sparked that whole thing. I don't believe in any of that stuff. I mean, just like my organization, we don't really support certifications. We're not inclined to believe fair trade or Rainforest Alliance either when it comes to chocolate. So, I get and I appreciate people wanting to, I always say that I appreciate people wanting to do less harm to non-human animals. My mom will be like, I bought cage-free eggs. And I'll be like, I wish you would need eggs, but, so I get that and I appreciate that. But I also think that if people really, truly want to be informed, they should go to the farms themselves. And that is a very privileged perspective, but I think those tend to be the people who are buying that way anyway. So I don't really believe in the certifications. Again, how can you, at the end of the day, they're going to be trucked off and slaughtered somewhere. And that is going to cause a tremendous amount of fear in each one of those individual animals, from the cows who tremble to the birds who are sometimes thrown in the scalding pot still alive, who are boiled alive. You can't get away from that.
I do agree that folks, the privileged comment, because I'm a very big fan of cage-free eggs, and I did not realize how much more they cost than regular eggs until my roommate called attention to it a few years ago. So those dollars do add up.
Yeah. And there's layers of privilege, right? I mean, we both experience different forms of that maybe white people haven't experienced. But, there's different forms of privilege. And I always acknowledge that even though my mom raised my sisters and I by herself, we had a car, and a car in and of itself is a privilege. Eating every day, eating more than one time a day is a privilege, unfortunately, in this country as well. And it shouldn't be that way.
All right, so we're coming up on time. Is there anything else you would want folks to know, to take away from today's conversation?
I think more than anything is just to keep an open mind. And if you do have the privilege of thinking about where your food comes from, look into it. I mean, we spend a lot of times maybe looking into the best TV or the best car and all that kind of stuff. And we owe the same thing to the foods that we eat, to the people who are harvesting them. And we owe it to ourselves. We call it like eating your ethics, like making sure whatever you're putting in your mouth meet your ethics. Do you not believe in cruelty to animals? Maybe try to stop eating them. If you don't believe in slavery, then be careful where your chocolate's coming from. There's different things that we can do to make sure that we eat our ethics and to not feel overwhelmed by all of this, but think of these as beautiful opportunities to make changes in your life that will have an impact, on your individual self, but also using your collective voices to help create change in the world.
Love it. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you all for having me. It was very fun.
To keep up with everything going on at Alternatives or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Thanks for listening.